If I were asked what I understood divinity to be, I would say, by that I understand the living beings of the ultraviolet and ultra-red forces and worlds. In former times they were embodied and moved about in complete purity. Today they live on in human beings. The gods slumber in bestialized human bodies, but the day is coming when they will rise up again. We were electric, we will be electric. To be electric and to be divine is the same thing. By means of the electric eye, primitive man was omniscient. Through inner electrical power, they were omnipotent. The omniscient and omnipotent has the right to call itself God. These are the words of Jörg Lanz von Liebenfels, outlining his radical vision of divinity and human potential. Adolf Josef Lanz, who would later be known as Jörg Lanz von Liebenfels, was born on July 19, 1874, in Vienna, Austria-Hungary. His birth came at the time of transformation in Europe. The Industrial Revolution was in full swing, transforming societies and economies across the continent. In Vienna, this period marked the twilight of the Habsburg Empire, a multinational state that had dominated Central Europe for centuries. Lanz's early years were shaped by the complex social and cultural landscape of Fonda Siècle Vienna. The city was a melting pot of ideas, where traditional imperial pomp coexisted with modern artistic and intellectual movements. It was home to figures like Sigmund Freud, Gustav Klimt, and Gustav Mahler, who were revolutionizing their respective fields. Little is known about Lanz's immediate family or his early education. However, we do know that he grew up in a predominantly Catholic environment, which would have a large influence on his later thought. The Catholic Church still held significant sway in the Habsburg Empire, particularly in education and social life. As a young man, Lanz was exposed to the tensions and debates that characterized Austrian society at the time. The empire was grappling with questions of nationalism and identity, as various ethnic groups sought greater autonomy. At the same time, a critical eye towards the Semitic populations was gaining popularity, ensconced by populist politicians like Karl Luege, who would become mayor of Vienna in 1897. In 1893, at the age of 19, Lanz entered the Cistercian order, becoming a monk at the Holy Cross Monastery of Heiligenkreuz. The Cistercian order, known for its austere lifestyle and dedication to scholarship, provided Lanz with a rigorous intellectual and spiritual environment. At Heiligenkreuz, he took the name Brother George and immersed himself in biblical studies and church history. This period of study and contemplation would have a lasting impact on his thought, even as he later diverged dramatically from Orthodox Christian teachings. During his time at the monastery, Lanz had access to extensive libraries and the ancient manuscripts, and became fascinated with the biblical story of the Nephilim, the sons of God, who, according to the book of Genesis, mated with human women. This story, with its suggestion of interaction between divine or superhuman beings and ordinary humans, would later form a cornerstone of his theozoological theories. Lanz's monastic years coincided with significant developments in the fields of archaeology and anthropology. The late 19th century saw a surge of interest in ancient civilizations and prehistoric human remains. Discoveries like Heinrich Schliemann's excavation of Troy, 1871 to 1873, and the unearthing of Neanderthal fossils sparked public fascination with human origins and lost golden ages. While cloistered in the monastery, Lanz would have been aware of these developments, which likely fueled his speculations about human prehistory. It was also during this time that the work of Charles Darwin was gaining widespread attention and generating controversy. Darwin's theory of evolution, first published in 1859, had by the 1890s become a subject of intense debate in scientific, religious, and popular circles. The idea that humans had evolved from earlier primates challenged traditional religious accounts of creation and raised unsettling questions about human nature and its destiny. For Lanz, immersed in biblical studies, yet aware of these scientific developments, this period seems to be one of intellectual ferment. He began to develop unorthodox interpretations of Scripture seeking to reconcile biblical narratives with emerging scientific theories and his own esoteric ideas. However, Lanz's time at Heiligenkreuz was not destined to last. In 1899, after 6 years as a monk, he left the monastery. The exact circumstances of his departure are disputed. Some sources claim he was expelled for carnal and worldly desires, suggesting a breach of his monastic vows. Lanz himself, however, maintained that he left voluntarily, driven by a desire to pursue his studies and ideas outside the constraints of monastic life. Regardless of the precise reasons, Lanz's departure from Heiligenkreuz marked a significant turning point in his life. He was now 25 years old, shaped by years of religious study, but increasingly drawn to unorthodox ideas. As he left the monastery behind, he was poised to enter a new phase of his intellectual journey, one that would lead him deeper into the world of occultism and racial theory. Upon leaving the monastery, Lanz returned to Vienna, a city that was then at the height of its cultural and intellectual effervescence. The turn of the century was a time of tremendous creativity and ferment in the Austrian capital. In addition to its reputation for music and the arts, Vienna had become a new center for movements in psychology, philosophy, and the occult sciences. And Lanz quickly immersed himself in this heady atmosphere. He began to publish on esoteric topics, now using the name Jörg Lanz von Liebenfels. The aristocratic von, a self-bestowed addition that reflected his growing sense of a special mission and heritage. One of the key influences on Lanz during this time period was that of the Theosophical Society. Founded in 1875 by Helena Blavatsky, Theosophy blended elements of Eastern religions, Western esotericism, and scientific speculation. It promoted ideas such as reincarnation, karma, and the existence of hidden masters guiding human evolution. Theosophy had gained a significant following in Europe and America, attracting seekers dissatisfied with traditional religion and materialist science. Lanz was particularly drawn to the theosophical concept of root races, the idea that human evolution proceeded through a series of distinct racial stages, each more advanced than the last. This notion dovetailed with his own developing theories about human prehistory and racial differences. Another important influence was Guido von List, an Austrian occultist and Volkish writer. List had developed a variant of theosophy called Ariosophy, which claimed that the Aryan race possessed a special occult power and a hidden history stretching back to Atlantis. Lanz would incorporate many of List's ideas into his own work, further radicalizing them. During this period, Lanz also delved into the burgeoning field of racial theory. He studied the works of Arthur de Gobineau, whose essay on the inequality of human races had laid the foundation for much of modern scientific racism. Gobineau argued that racial differences were fundamental and immutable, and that the mixing of races led to degradation and cultural decline. These ideas were further developed by Houston Stewart Chamberlain, whose book, The Foundations of the 19th Century, became a key text of the so-called Aryan-Semitic conflict. Chamberlain argued for the superiority of the Aryan race and saw world history as a struggle between Aryans and Jews. Lanz absorbed these theories, integrating them with his religious background and occult interests to form a unique ideological synthesis. From there, Lanz began to develop his concept of theozoology. Drawing on his monastic studies, his occult researches, and contemporary racial theories, he formulated an alternative history of human evolution. In this narrative, the pure Aryan race had once possessed godlike powers, which had been diluted through interbreeding with subhuman beastmen. Lanz's ideas found their major first expression in 1903, when he published a booklet titled Catholicism versus Jesuitism. In this work, he began to articulate his vision of a racially pure Christianity free from what he saw as the corrupting influence of Judaism. From there, the year 1905 marked a major milestone in Lanz's career with the publication of his magnum opus, Theozoology, or the Science of the Sodomite Apelings and the Divine Electron. This dense, obscure work laid out Lanz's full theory of human racial history and evolution. In Theozoology, Lanz presents a fantastic narrative of human origins. He posits his original theory about a species of beastmen alongside early humans, and these beings were the source of many myths and legends, and their interbreeding with humans was the true cause of racial differences and social problems. In Lanz's view, the pure human type was represented by Nordic and Germanic peoples, while other races were seen as more influenced by beastmen ancestry. This led him to advocate for eugenic policies and strict control of human breeding. His work also included speculations about human physiology, which we'll be delving into deeper later. While Theozoology itself had limited readership, its publication marked the beginning of Lanz's most influential period. In the same year of 1905, he founded a magazine called Ostara, named after a Germanic goddess. Ostara became the primary vehicle for spreading Lanz's ideas to a wider audience. The magazine combined Lanz's esoteric racial theories with more practical political and social commentary. It again advocated for Aryan racial purity and related occult topics, alternative health practices, and speculative history. Ostara quickly gained a significant readership. By some accounts, its circulation reached as high as 100,000 at its peak. The magazine appealed to a range of readers dissatisfied with modern society and drawn to its promise of national and racial renewal. Its mix of mysticism, racial theory, and political radicalism was particularly attractive to young men searching for meaning and identity in the rapidly changing world of early 20th century Central Europe. One of Ostara's most famous readers was the young Adolf Hitler, who encountered the magazine during his time in Vienna from 1908 to 1913. While the extent of Ostara's influence on Hitler is debated by historians, there are clear parallels between the ideas promoted in the magazine and later Nazi ideology. Hitler himself mentioned Lanz in Mein Kampf, referring to a certain Lanz who wrote about racial purity. Through Ostara and his other writings, Lanz became a significant figure in the Völkisch movement, a loose network of nationalist groups that flourished in German-speaking lands in the early 20th century. This movement, which blended romantic nationalism and occultism, would provide much of the ideological groundwork for National Socialism. The period from 1908 to the end of World War I saw Lanz further develop and propagate his ideas. He continued to publish Ostara regularly, expanding its themes and refining his racial theories. During this time, he also founded the Order of the New Templars, a quasi-religious organization dedicated to promoting Aryan racial purity. The ONT was established in 1900, but gained momentum after the success of Ostara. It was modeled loosely on the medieval Knights Templar, with Lanz seeing himself as reviving an ancient tradition of Aryan warrior monks. The order conducted elaborate rituals, combining elements of Catholic liturgy with pagan symbolism and racial mysticism. Members of the ONT were required to prove their Aryan ancestry and undergo rigorous physical and spiritual training. Lanz envisioned the order as the nucleus of a new Aryan nobility that would lead the racial regeneration of Europe. He acquired several castles in Austria and Germany to serve as ONT strongholds, the most famous being Berg-Werfenstein on the Danube. During this period, Lanz's writings became increasingly apocalyptic. He predicted a coming race war that would purge the world of inferior races and restore Aryan dominance. These ideas found a receptive audience in the turbulent years leading up to World War I, as tensions between European powers escalated and nationalist sentiments reached a fever pitch. Lanz's work also began to attract attention beyond German-speaking lands. His ideas influenced esoteric movements in other countries, particularly France and England. In France, the writer Josephine Pilaudon incorporated elements of Lanz's theories into his own occult system. In England, Lanz's work found echoes in some branches of theosophy and in the writings of racial mystics like Aleister Crowley. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 seemed to many of Lanz's followers to confirm his apocalyptic predictions. Lanz himself saw the war as the beginning of the great racial struggle he had long prophesied. He interpreted the war in stark racial terms, viewing it as a battle between Aryan Germans and inferior races manipulated by Jews. However, the war years also brought practical difficulties for Lanz and his movement. Paper shortages and censorship made publishing Ostara more challenging. Many of his followers were called up for military service, and some of the ONT's properties were requisitioned for the war effort. Despite these setbacks, Lanz continued to write and develop his ideas throughout the war. He produced a series of racial metaphysical studies, further elaborating on his theories of human prehistory and racial evolution. These works, with titles like The Book of German Psalms and The Bible for the Initiated and The Speech of the Gods, blended scientific speculation with mystical revelations and political theory. However, as the war dragged on and Austria-Hungary's position became increasingly desperate, Lanz's writings took on an even more strident tone. He blamed military setbacks on racial mixing and Jewish influence, calling for more extreme measures to purify the Aryan race. These ideas, once considered fringe, were now finding increasing resonance as the old imperial order crumbled and society was plunged into chaos. The defeat of Germany and Austria had spawned a multitude of conservative movements, many of which incorporated elements similar to Lanz's theories. In this crowded ideological marketplace, Lanz began to struggle to maintain his distinct voice and influence. Despite these challenges, he continued to publish Ostara throughout the 1920s, though with decreasing frequency. The magazine's content evolved to address the concerns of the post-war era, focusing more on practical political issues while still maintaining its core of racial mysticism. During this period, Lanz also expanded his publishing efforts, producing a series of books that further elaborated on his theozoological theories. The rise of the National Socialist Party in Germany during the 1920s and early 1930s presented both opportunities and challenges for Lanz. On one hand, many of the ideas promoted by a faction of the National Socialists, racial purity and the glorification of an Aryan past, were strikingly similar to those Lanz had been advocating for decades. Some historians have argued that Lanz should be seen as one of the ideological forerunners of National Socialism, pointing to the parallels between his writings and Nazi racial theories. Hitler did refer to Lanz. However, as the National Socialist movement gained power, Lanz found himself increasingly marginalized. The National Socialists, while drawing on many of the same ideological currents, were wary of competing occult and esoteric movements. A faction of the party sought to establish their own racial mythology and were suspicious of independent ideologues who might challenge their authority. Additionally, Hitler was a very practical man, and inserting any form of strange Christianity might further alienate his movement. When the National Socialists came to power in Germany in 1933, Lanz initially hoped that they would implement the racial policies he had long advocated for. He attempted to align himself with the new regime, emphasizing the similarities between his ideas and National Socialist ideology. However, his efforts were met with little success. The National Socialists viewed Lanz's claims to have influenced Hitler as presumptuous and potentially threatening to the Führer's image. Moreover, they found Lanz's particular blend of Catholic mysticism and racial theory to be incompatible or divisive. In 1938, following the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria by Nazi Germany, Lanz's publications were banned in both Germany and Austria. The exact reasons for this ban are not entirely clear, but it seems to have been part of a broader National Socialist effort to suppress competing occult and esoteric movements. He then spent the war years in Hungary, continued to write and develop his theories, though now with a much reduced audience. He maintained correspondence with some of his followers and attempted to keep the Order of the New Templars alive, albeit in a much diminished form. During this period, Lanz's writings became increasingly esoteric and divorced from practical politics. He delved increasingly into topics like the electrical nature of the human soul and the possibility of scientifically verifying reincarnation. As the war turned against Germany and its allies, Lanz's apocalyptic predictions took on a new urgency. He interpreted the conflict as the final battle between Aryan forces and the subhuman races he had long criticized. However, as purported Nazi atrocities became apparent, Lanz began to distance himself from his earlier, more explicitly racist writings. Following the end of World War II and the narrative given by the Nuremberg trials, Lanz attempted to reinvent himself and his ideas. He claimed that the Nazis had misunderstood and perverted his theories. In private correspondence and later writings, he argued that his concept of race had always been more spiritual than biological, and that he had never advocated for the kind of genocidal policies purportedly implemented by the Nazis. However, these efforts at rehabilitation met with little success. The intellectual and cultural climate of post-war Europe was hostile to the kind of esoteric racism Lanz had promoted. Many of his former followers had been disillusioned by the war, and he struggled to find a new audience for his ideas. Despite these setbacks, Lanz continued to write and publish on esoteric topics until his death. His later works tended to focus more on mystical and spiritual themes, again downplaying the racial elements that had been so central to his earlier thought. In 1951, Lanz published Introduction to Sexual Physics, or The Love of the Future, a work that attempted to synthesize his racial theories with new developments in physics and biology. This book, much like that of his later output, found little resonance in the post-war world. Lanz died on April 22, 1954, in Vienna, largely forgotten by the public. His passing received little attention in the press, and his once influential ideas seem to have been consigned to obscurity. But now that we understand the man, let's dive into his teachings. Lanz begins by framing theozoology as such. The truth, which I am submitting chiefly to my close and dear friends, is a historically well-established fact, which humanity has intentionally forgotten. Until now, its revelation has been prevented by all sorts of tortures and persecutions. It is the truth, which that one taught about whom it is said that he is set for the fall and rising again of many. That my rediscoveries will be the fall of many, I am firmly convinced. Therefore, I am preparing myself for the most furious attacks, and I only welcome them. But besides my friends, there are certainly many other people whose these teachings could lead to a resurrection, to whom it will say and confirm nothing new, but rather it will express their already long-held ideas. From there, Lanz begins with the idea that Earth was once established by several distinct types of humanoid beings, each with unique characteristics. These beings, according to Lanz, were the true source of many ancient myths and religious stories. The first were the Adumu, which Lanz described as primitive, ape-like creatures. He believed these were the ancestors of what he considered lower human races. The Adumu, in Lanz's view, were bestial and lacking in spiritual qualities. Next were the Pagutu, strange amphibious creatures with scaly skin. Lanz believed these beings inhabited swamps, rivers, and coastal areas. He saw them as the source of many myths about sea monsters and water spirits. The third group in Lanz's prehistoric pantheon were the Baza, also known as Bays. These were dwarf-like humanoids, often misshapen or deformed. Lanz pointed to various ancient artworks depicting small, oddly proportional figures as evidence for the existence of these beings. Finally, and most importantly in Lanz's hierarchy, were the Asuru. These were winged, bird-like humanoids with electrical powers. Lanz associated these beings with angels and other mythical winged creatures from various world religions and mythologies. He believed the Asuru were the most advanced of all these beings and the source of humanity's highest potential. According to Lanz, these various beings not only coexisted, but also interbred with early humans, resulting in a complex genealogy of hybrid offspring. This interbreeding, he believed, was the true story behind many ancient myths and religious texts. Lanz's interpretation of ancient history centered around reinterpreting those scriptures, particularly the Bible, through the lens of theozoology. He believed that there were coded references to these prehistoric beings and their interactions with humans. For example, Lanz interpreted the story of Adam and Eve not as an account of the first humans, but as a coded narrative about the interbreeding between advanced beings, the Asuru, and the more primitive ones, the Adumu. The fall from grace in his interpretation was actually a descent into racial impurity through miscegenation. To Lanz, the serpent in the Garden of Eden was not a literal snake, but a representation of the Adumu or the other lower beings. The act of eating the forbidden fruit, he believed, symbolized sexual intercourse between these beings and the more advanced races. This, according to Lanz, was the true original sin that led to the degradation of humanity. He also reinterpreted other biblical stories. The flood of Noah, for instance, was seen as an attempt by divine forces to cleanse the earth of the impure offspring resulting from interbreeding. The Tower of Babel story, in his view, was about the confusion resulting from racial mixing. Lanz didn't limit his reinterpretations to the Bible, though. He saw evidence of his prehistoric beings in Greek myths and heroes. For instance, they interpreted these stories about the Asuru and their descendants. Native American legends of thunderbirds were seen as memories of Asuru encounters. This approach to mythology and religion led Lanz to develop a complex system of symbolism. He believed ancient symbols and religious iconography were actually encoded references to prehistoric beings and the practices associated with them. The cross, for instance, was interpreted not as a symbol of Christ's crucifixion, but as a representation of the electrical powers of the Asuru. His theories also extended into his interpretation of archaeological findings in ancient art. He looked at ancient figurines and artworks depicting strange humanoid creatures not as mythical representations or artistic license, but as accurate depictions of the beings he believed once roamed and sodomized across the earth. For instance, he pointed to beliefs from ancient Assyria showing scaly two-legged creatures as potential depictions of the Bagutu. Egyptian and Mesopotamian art, featuring dwarf-like figures or deities, were to Lanz clear evidence of the existence of the Baza. Winged features in ancient art from Sumerian reliefs to Christian angel iconography were all interpreted as depictions of the Asuru. Lanz's theology also proposed a more traditional notion of humanity's course. In his view, human evolution wasn't a linear progression from ape-like ancestors to modern humans. Instead, he believed it was a process of degradation involving interbreeding between humans and other humanoid species. This led Lanz to develop his theories about human races. He proposed that certain human populations, particularly those of European descent, were more closely related to the higher beings like the Asuru. Other races, he believed, had a greater proportion of genes from the lower beings like the Adumu. In Lanz's racial hierarchy, what he termed Aryans, or people of Germanic descent, were at the top, being the purest descendants of the Asuru. He believed that these people had the greatest potential for spiritual and evolutionary advancement. Other races were seen as more degenerate due to their supposed greater proportion of Adumu ancestry. I'll let you figure out who those races are. These racial theories then went on to form Lanz's ideas about eugenics and selective breeding. He believed that through careful control of human reproduction, it would be possible to purify the human race, gradually breeding out the traits inherited from the lower beings and enhancing those from the Asuru. And this was all tied to his idea about physiology, particularly his theories about bioelectricity. He believed that the Asuru possessed advanced electrical powers, and that traces of these abilities remained in their human descendants. The pineal gland played the largest role in Lanz's theories about bioelectricity. He speculated that this small endocrine gland, located in the brain, was actually a vestigial organ from our Asuru ancestors. He believed that the pineal gland once functioned as a biological antenna capable of sending and receiving electrical signals. According to Lanz, the pineal gland, working in conjunction with the pituitary gland, could generate and control powerful electrical fields. These fields, he believed, could extend beyond the body, allowing for various forms of extrasensory perception and even direct influence over the physical world. To Lanz, the eyes also played a special role in this electrical system. He believed that the eyes could emit as well as receive electrical signals, acting as a kind of biological cathode ray tube. This, he claimed, explained phenomena such as the ability of some individuals to see auras or other invisible phenomena. Lanz also speculated about the role of the other glands and organs in this electrical system. The thyroid gland, for instance, was thought to act as a regulator for the body's electrical charge. The heart wasn't just a pump for blood, but also a critical component in the body's electrical circuit. To Lanz, this bioelectrical power was intimately connected with spiritual and mental abilities. He believed that the electrical signals generated by the pineal gland were the physical basis for telepathy, clairvoyance, and other psychic phenomena. Accordingly, mastery over one's internal electricity was the key to unlocking these supernatural abilities. Lanz also delved into the realm of health and science. He believed that many illnesses were the result of imbalances or blockages in the body's electrical system. His proposed treatments often involved practices he thought would restore proper electrical flow, such as the exposure to certain types of light or the use of specific metals and crystals. One of the most controversial aspects of Lanz's work was his extensive discussion of what he termed sodomy. In Lanz's usage, this term went far beyond its conventional meaning. He used it to refer to any form of sexual interaction between what he considered higher and lower beings, or any sexual practices he deemed unnatural or degenerate. Thus, the real battle was that of racial and spiritual purity, of sodomy and miscegenation, with many myths and religious prohibitions actually being coded warnings against these practices. With Lanz's view of society being a battle between higher and lower beings, along with the loss of ancient wisdom and abilities, he saw many modern social movements, particularly those promoting equality or challenging traditional hierarchies, as symptoms of degeneration. He believed that the natural order, as established by the ancient Asuru and their immediate descendants, was one of strict hierarchy and racial separation. To counter what he saw as societal decline, Lanz proposed a range of social and political reforms. These included strict racial segregation, eugenics programs to purify the human race, and the establishment of a theocratic state led by those he believed to be the purest descendants of the Asuru. In terms of reincarnation and spiritual evolution, Lanz believed that souls progress through multiple lives, gradually evolving towards the perfected state once possessed by the Asuru. However, he thought this process could be hindered or reversed by sodomitic practices or interbreeding with lower beings. In Lanz's eschatology, or theories about the end times, he predicted a final conflict between the forces of purity and degeneracy. He believed that this would culminate in the reemergence of a pure race of Asura-like beings who would establish a new golden age on Earth. With that, he believed many modern technological advancements were actually rediscoveries of abilities that the Asuru and their descendants once possessed naturally. In his view, inventions like the telegraph or radio were crude imitations of the natural telepathic abilities he believed humans once had. To Lanz, technology offered the possibility of developing technology that could amplify the body's natural electrical fields or stimulate the pineal gland to unlock psychic powers. His theories about the Earth itself were related. He believed that the planet had its own electrical field and that certain locations were particularly charged with this energy. Ancient sacred sites and temples, in his view, were built upon these power spots to harness their energy. Along with that, he believed in the existence of hidden underground civilizations, remnants of the advanced beings he believed once ruled the Earth. These subterranean realms might still house pure-blooded descendants of the Asuru or advanced technology from Earth's prehistoric past. Coming back to sexuality, Lanz condemned what he saw as sodomitic practices, but he also believed that controlled and ritualized sexual practices could be used to enhance spiritual and electrical powers. He developed these theories about the role of sexual energy in activating latent psychic abilities. In sum, the ultimate goal of human evolution was to reclaim the advanced abilities of the Asuru ancestors. He believed that through a combination of selective breeding, spiritual practices, and the development of technology to enhance natural electrical abilities, humanity could eventually evolve into a race of godlike beings. To end practically, here's what Lanz advises those of European descent to do. First, love your neighbor. Quote, Jesus emphasizes that he doesn't want to change the doctrine of Jehovah in the least, and it is easier for heaven and earth to pass away than one tittle of the law to fail. Whosoever separates himself from his wife, from a wife of his kind of mankind, and marries a foreign woman, a woman of lower kind, he is committing fornication. The Jehovah and Jesus doctrines are religions without tenets of faith and without commandments as to customs. They always say, if you do that, then you'll have to atone in this lifetime. It is the error of modern men to make humanity happy by instituting laws. Better men create their own better laws that are engraved deeply in the carnal tablets of his heart. Laws are of no use because virtue cannot be learned, it is inborn. Jesus only gives two forms of counsel: love God and your neighbor. Only love the one highest God, the patriarch of white men. The second commandment is the same as the first. This eternal and living God is not loved and served in external customs, prayers, and fasting, but rather solely by sexually loving his neighbor, i.e., a human close to his own kind. God is hated and insulted when children of lower quality are generated and then these are pushed down through the centuries according to their kind. Love your brother. That is the basis of the gospel. In an old Scholion to Clemens of Alexandria, brother is explained as someone who is similar to one's own extraction. Paul offers as evidence that he is an apostle and disciple of Jesus. The fact that he has with him a sister, i.e. a concubine as wife and lover, just as Peter did. Second, Lanz called to cease brotherly love with those outside the European race. Quote, humanitarian brotherly love is one of the most disastrous deceptions of the Sodomite Apelings. Rome always preached brotherly love to the Germans only. The Germans should practice brotherly love. Rome, the Romans and the Slavs, never bothered themselves with brotherly love. I ask any historian, has papal diplomacy ever been guided by brotherly love? Furthermore, I ask any cultural historian, has all this Christian brotherly love ever helped even one spiritual man? Everything the German spiritual men created, they created from within themselves. Brotherly love never did them any good, nor was it helpful to them. Swindlers have gorged themselves fat on the gifts of Christian brotherly love, but to a Mozart, a Schubert, a Schiller, and many, many other great men, it denied even a dry piece of bread. If brotherly love does not serve the interests of such men, then it is not good for anything. Here we must finally intervene with force. Away with false and suicidal brotherly love, which was invented by the Sodomite Apelings. We must arm ourselves against pity, our greatest weakness, with a godlike hard-heartedness, yet with one which seeks human benefit. Third, Lanz believed that humanity needed to maintain a patriarchal society. Quote, everywhere and always we must protect the institution of marriage, for it is the secure refuge of the race, the warm nest of the young phoenix and the future God-man. For the sake of the kingdom of heaven we must become eunuchs. As highly as we honor the wife and the family and in the home, we must just as intensely fight against the intrusion of women into public life, because the ultimate outcome of these efforts would be, and to some extent is already, unilateral women's rights, which would make the world into a big brothel, in which everything revolves around penises and pussies in a silly and absurd satyr's orgy, while the proper wife, the loyal mother of the house, and the healthy, strong troop of children will be mercilessly driven of the chaste and legitimate home. No one, other than those women with their lascivious ape-like natures, destroyed the cultures of antiquity, and they will bring down our culture as well if men do not stop and think soon. The adulterous and sensual woman belongs in the whorehouse. The honor of motherhood is withdrawn from her, and her name is blotted out of the book of life. Likewise, criminals, the mentally ill, or those with hereditary diseases should be prevented from reproducing. If we only allow fit persons to reproduce, the hospitals, prisons, and the giant criminal justice system will become superfluous. Pure breeding is the priority of true disciples of the Logos, who abhor all bastardizing, mongrelization, as both contrary to law and godless. The male semen has an effect on the woman, such that the child, even when it comes from a legitimate father, still inherits characteristics from all those men with whom the wife had had premarital or extramarital intercourse. It is for this reason that the old laws favor marriage with virgins, the privilege of the firstborn, and draw a sharp distinction between the sexual rights of women and men. Just as different races of men have unequal rights, so too do men and women have unequal rights. The old custom of law, which allowed the lord of the manor to sleep with every virgin first, proves that the ancients knew that it is the man who is responsible for breeding the race upward. Lastly, if married, one should love their wife in a more spiritual manner. If seeking to remain unmarried, he or she should focus attention on spiritual attainment. Quote, "The savage and unbridled human sexual passions are harmful and unhealthy. Husband and wife must get closer to one another and love each other in a cooler way, yet in a way which is all the more spiritual and freer. In the Logia of the Lord it is said, 'When you trample the garment of shame with your feet, and when the two become one, and man is neither man nor woman with his wife, then the kingdom of heaven will be upon us.' In the resurrection there will be no more marriage. Humans will once more be angels, i.e. hermaphrodites. We no longer generate men by means of carnal intercourse, but rather perhaps by means of radiation. Jesus came to abolish the work of woman, Logia. We will once more become similar to the electrical god-men, physically as well. We shall become pure gods. We must take off the dark pelt of the ape and put on the shining breastplate of the god-man. We come from God, and to God we will return. That is the great secret of the transmigration of souls, and of the process of becoming man, of the suffering, of the death and of the resurrection, the return, and of the great supper of the gods. Christ is the original man of the past and the evolved man in the future. He is the Alpha and the Omega, beginning and end. Women must have themselves baptized in the holy temple well of Siloam, the waters of which bubble coolly and softly. Cold Boreas must again sweep through the withered garden of mankind in Nordic blood, extinguish the southern ape rut. Agape, pure love devoid of any ape nature, yet love in an entirely sexual sense, is the innermost kernel of the doctrine of Jesus. Only in this way can the otherwise theologically inexplicable pagan portrayals of the lust-filled revels, agape feasts, Eucharist equals love between men and women, cupids, and couples embracing in love found in the catacombs be explained. Our blonde-haired baby Jesus is certainly none other than Bacchus, Cupid, and Sciph. Cupid and Psyche are even seen quite often in primitive Christian iconography, and between them is usually the basket, with sodomite bread, which they have refused, while the lascivious naked woman cannot separate herself from the sodomite basket in her lap. Well, there's a lot more we could go into about theozoology. I'm going to let you draw your own conclusions, because I don't want anything to happen to this channel. His work is very dense, and it's very obscure, and it's very difficult to summarize in an accessible manner, since it's honestly difficult to read and follow any sort of thread. It's very disjointed and digressive. However, I hope you will come away with a better understanding of both the man and his seminal work. If you're interested, you can perhaps give his book a read. Just be ready for... yeah, it's crazy. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you find this topic interesting, if you want to hear more about Lanz and theozoology, maybe go more in depth, let me know in the comments. We can always do a follow-up video that goes into more of the spiritual techniques and other things in his other writings that are more grounded and practical. Thank you, and God bless.